Good. So what we're doing all this month and the next month in May is, as it were, limbering up for the 4 Sanghas retreat at Taraloka, which is on the theme of the Heart Sutra. And we're limbering up by exploring some of the teachings which are, as it were, contained in the Heart Sutra, or which are taken for granted in the Heart Sutra. So rather than taking them for granted, let's get familiar with them before we discover what the Heart Sutra says about them, if you're on the retreat, which I strongly recommend you are, last weekend of May. Quite a few people in this room will be there, which is lovely to see. So I won't say very much about the Heart Sutra, if anything. At the end we will chant it, or we will recite it. So in the first talk at the beginning of the month, I talked about wrong view, right view, and perfect vision. So what we're essentially doing in these 2 months before the retreat is exploring right view. And by right view, I'm using Vajrapriya's terminology, which means the kinds of teachings, even doctrines if you like, the lists, the ideas, which are there to help us, as it were, orientate our perspective in a more helpful way. So these are the teachings which help us get a clearer perspective on life. Perfect vision is the experience when those perspectives become, as it were, embodied, when they become our natural way of seeing. They're no longer ideas that we're trying to hold in our head in order to cure some of our troubles. It's just the natural way of experiencing. And then last week I started in on the first of these lists, the skandas, the 5 skandas, the 5 heaps, and I'm going to carry that on this week. They're, as it were, the sort of the centerpiece of the Heart Sutra, or they're there front and center. So it's helpful to find out what they are. I was reading a little bit of Vajrapriya on the skandas. I'll explain what they are in a second, but what Vajrapriya says about the skandas is, he says, if you know anything about Buddhism at all, you'll be familiar with the 5 skandas. So there you go, there's a little gauntlet thrown down. Of course you're familiar with the 5 skandas because you know something about Buddhism. But it's not actually a list that's often dusted down, I don't think. Even Vajrapriya didn't talk about them that much. So here we are, giving them a little bit of a dusting down. So the 5 skandas, it's this list of, as it were, components that make up a human being. I'm going to go into that a little bit more, but it's basically a way of seeing what makes us up. It covers the whole gamut, so to speak, of a being. And the Buddha was very keen on the skandas. He referred to this list a lot. In fact, there's a book which is about that fat called the Samyutta Nikaya, the Connected Discourses. And there's a whole chunk, there's about 160 different discourses in there, all about the skandas. And even throughout the rest of the Buddha's discourses, you'll find the skandas referenced very, very frequently. So they're a very important list, a very important lens, if you like. So, what causes our dukkha? What causes our suffering is, one way we can look at it is we're not seeing things clearly. We get confused by our perceptual apparatus, the way that we view the world, we get confused. So we want a clearer understanding of the way things are, a clearer understanding of reality, and that will, at one stroke, remove an awful lot of dukkha. So how do you go about doing that? Well, from the Buddha's point of view, we need insight, we need a clear understanding, this clear-eyed perspective to correct these perceptual distortions. It's a bit like taking a rather bad set of glasses and seeing things much clearer. But the trouble is that the way that we perceive the world, the way we perceive ourselves and the world, is very, very deeply conditioned. It's like there's this whole raft of what you might call common sense, the common sense view of the world. And in order to get past that common sense view of the world, we have to look afresh and not take anything for granted, which is quite challenging, really. You have to look more closely at experience, even analyse our experience. And I'm using the word analyse in the technical sense, which I looked up, which is defined as a detailed examination of the elements or structure of something. A detailed examination of the elements or structure of something. So it's like we get to know something better by pulling it apart, so you might imagine looking under a microscope and sort of seeing, that's a little leg and that's a little head and that's a little body or whatever it is. You're sort of looking in more detail to see what makes something up. And so in terms of us as a human person, he gave us this way of looking more closely to see what makes us up. It's a little bit like a prism will refract white light into all these different colours. It's quite similar to that in a way. It's because the skandas are ways of dividing ourselves up, so to speak, into 5 elements or 5 structures. But like the different colours after it's been through a prism, it's not like they're 5 completely separate, distinct things. They sort of shade into each other. And the word skanda is translating heap, which is a marvellously imprecise term, isn't it? 5 heaps. So you can imagine 5 heaps of different grains which kind of overlap, they're not completely distinct. So the bottom line, I'll give you the bottom line here. The bottom line is that we tend to relate to ourselves as, in one sense, fixed. It's like there's this sense of, no matter what's going on through life, there's a kind of me that's going through life and it's the same me that sort of goes through the whole life, so to speak. So there's a sense of fixedness about me. And that me that's going through life is a kind of entity that is abstracted out of our experience. So although, I see all these things, I hear all these things, and there's this sort of body thing, somehow behind all that, there's this something that we call a me. And the Buddha's giving us this way of refracting our experience into these different colours, so to speak, to say, okay, let's take a look at this. Is this really the case? Is this really what's going on? So I'm going to go into the 5 skandas now, and hopefully we'll sort of draw out as I go along. It's just worth saying, we could easily spend all year doing this without exaggeration. There's so much we could go into. A whole year, yes. I may not have anyone else in the room with me, but really the Dharma's like this. You can go into any part of the Dharma and explore the whole Dharma through it. But there's an awful lot of depth to these skandhas. So last week I explored the first 2. The first one, and I semi-apologise for using the Sanskrit, but I'll try and translate the Sanskrit as well. The first one called rupa, which often is translated as form or corporeality. In other words, the sort of embodiedness of a being, the sort of physicality of a being, as experienced without much conception of of materiality, without a conception of us being made up of atoms and such like. It's the direct experience of this form. And so It's the sense of being embodied. So this is one of the things that we take as me or mine. I, me or mine. From time to time at least, we tend to take our sort of physical form as either me or mine. I went into this a bit last week, but you might imagine for example, if you're quite tall, I'm quite tall, I sort of identify with being quite tall. Yeah, I'm the kind of person who's quite tall. I quite like that. I quite like being tall. Or you might feel yourself to be quite short and like being short or not like being short. Or you might feel yourself to be strong, physically strong or not so strong. And you've probably got feelings about these. You might feel yourself to be healthy or infirm. Or you might have some temporary infirmment and, feel something about that. There's a sense of this being me. So these are all ways that we can, as it were, identify with our form. And as part of that, there's a sense of that form being, as it were, fixed. Because I'm a sort of fixed kind of person, that's the feeling of it, I'm this sort of fixed entity. So the form, my tallness or my thinness or whatever, I sort of think of as in some way a fixed feature of myself. But of course we all know that form, our body, changes. So we can reflect on the changes of our body. We can reflect how even our sort of sense of energeticness or our sense of strength or health changes. We can be sure that there's not very much about the body that remains the same. And sometimes that's experienced as good news, so if we're feeling unwell, then we can reflect that we'll probably at some stage feel well again. Not guaranteed, of course, but that's the way these things tend to work. It might be bad news because if we're feeling well, then we can be pretty sure we'll feel unwell at some stage. And we can be hopeful that we age and we will inevitably die. So these are the kind of changes that we can reflect on in terms of physical form. So we also talked about Vedana, which is the feeling tone to our experience. So all of our experience comes with this sort of colouring, which is either pleasant or painful or sort of somewhere in between. We're not a kind of neutral robot entity that's just kind of registering shapes and sounds and so on. We feel, and I'm talking about feel in a very sort of raw sense. I'm not talking about emotion, I'm talking about the way that impressions impress themselves on us. We sort of have this whole dimension, which is very difficult to talk about really. Hedonic tone is another way of translating Vedana, because everything comes with this positive or negative quality to it, with this pleasant or unpleasant quality to it. And it's really crucial to get a handle on this, because this very raw, very primitive aspect of experience conditions all this sort of later development in terms of, by later I mean in the moment. So I tread on a drawing pin, immediate unpleasantness, that then conditions emotion. Who left that drawing pin there? Who spilt a thing of drawing pins? Whatever it is. It's very quickly, Vedana very quickly triggers a set of conditions unfolding that might well not be very skillful. Very easily conditions unskillful emotion. Pleasant Vedana also, triggers whatever it is, addictive tendencies or craving or appropriativeness or whatever it is. So these very, very fleeting Vedanas and again we can explore, is Vedana fleeting? They can trigger strategies which don't work for us very well. Blaming or numbing out pain or addictive tendencies. All very significant consequences of not recognizing Vedana as Vedana. We tend to think that the Vedana of the moment will always be that way. We don't think that intellectually, but there's something about experiencing displeasure as though it's always going to be like this, or pleasure as though it's always going to be like this. We tend to overestimate the duration of Vedana very, very consistently. The pleasant Vedana that a particular cake will give us, or that a new car will give us, or that a new laptop will give us, or whatever it is. We tend to vastly overestimate just how long that Vedana will last. So, in terms of practice, again, we can really notice Vedana as it happens, really try and tune into that sort of wavelength of our being. It's very important, a part of mindfulness is the ability to recognise Vedana as Vedana. Notice how fleeting it is, notice how it's always moving, moment to moment. And recognise when we're identified with it, in other words, when it's not just as pain, as I'm in pain. Or it's not just, oh, it's quite a buoyant mood, it's, hey, I'm so happy. When we sort of buy into it and inhabit it, and this is what I am, we sort of absolutise this fleeting Vedana, this fleeting experience. Okay, so I talked about those last week. So I'll go on now to the last three. So the next one is called samnya, which means something like interpretation or perception or recognition. So this is the whole aspect of our experience whose job it is to take this mass of sensations that are constantly coming in. Every moment now you've got a whole mass of sensations coming in, visual and auditory and others as well, and trying to turn all of this into meaning. We're trying to make sense of the world, and it's a really important quality, isn't it, to be able to make sense of the world. We make sense of the world so that we can sort of categorise it into different objects. Okay, so we categorise people into, we can name them, and we name the objects around us. And this starts as an infant, doesn't it? When, mummy says, look, doggy, doggy. We're immediately starting to label experiences. So, little baby experiences all this sort of visual sensation and maybe sound sensation, and somehow or other learns to match this up with the word doggy, or mummy, or whatever it is. So right from the very get-go, we're learning how to turn all this fluid changing experience into a noun, into a single word that encompasses a tremendous amount of variation. So, okay, let's just do a little exercise on this. So I encourage you to take a hand. You've all got a hand there. And look at it and make shapes. See how many shapes you can make out of your hand, and try and surprise yourself with the kind of shapes that you can make. Can you find a shape where you would not recognise this object as a hand? Of course, we sort of know it's already there, doesn't it, because it's at the end of our hand, but if you were to see a picture like this, would you not recognise it as a hand? Now, if you were to try and train a robot or some sort of artificial, could you program to do this? very difficult bit of artificial intelligence to recognise all of these different shapes and shades and colours and lines, to recognise all of these different ones as a single entity. But we do it effortlessly. Very, very powerful bit of samyā. And maybe right now you can experience yourself trying to understand what I'm talking about, especially if it's a bit baffling. What is he going on about? That's samyā. That's samyā trying to make sense. Most of the time it's just working completely in the background. But then sometimes there's something that happens and you think, what's that all about? You hear a funny noise. What is that? What is that? So that's samyā sort of trying to work. So as I say, this is all really important stuff. And we need it. And there's something important about what samyā does, which is also problematic. Because samyā turns all of this experience into a concept, into a word. And words, concepts are static. So there's this thing, and then there's a word hand, which really doesn't encapsulate very much about it. So because we can label things, because we can, I can call myself Vajrapriya, and therefore I've immediately got a static concept, a static word, to encompass the whole realm of Vajrapriyaness, which is changing all the time. So because concepts staticify, make static, that has consequences. That's why we kind of need to undo those concepts from time to time to see things more clearly. More than that, samyā includes a whole realm of what you could call broader understandings, realm of views and perspectives, attitudes to the world. It's like all of this is a kind of background that we have for how we see the world. The world is as we see it. The world is not as it is. We're always seeing the world through all these perceptual filters. This is all the realm of samyā. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But in terms of practice, what can we do with samyā? Well, the first thing is notice it at work. With all of these skandas, the first thing to do is just to get familiar with them. What does it actually look like? What does samyā look like in experience? So just recognising, especially when it's, a good way to recognise it is when you get it wrong. When you think you see someone, and then, oh no, it's not that person. Or when you think you've understood something and then you realise, oh no, I didn't get that at all. I was with Vajradevi cycling the other day, and she fell off her bike, unfortunately. And we were just sort of getting back up again, and this cyclist stopped. He stopped in front of us and said, "Oh, can I give you a hand?" And I sort of looked up quickly and said, "No, I think we're okay, thanks." Looked back again. And the cyclist said, poor Vajradevi. And I sort of did a double take. And it was a Bayanara, a very dear friend. I'd not even recognised him. My mind was so sort of caught up with something else that I just kind of completely not recognised this person I know very well. So we can notice samyā at work or not at work, as the case may be. And we might notice how we sometimes need to change our samyā to take account of new information. In other words, change our opinion, change our view. You might have a political view that sometimes has to take account of new information. That can be discomforting, can't it? Scary stuff. And we can notice how we identify with samyā. So what this might look like is you might think you're the kind of person who understands something. You might think you're the kind of person who understands the skandas. Yeah, I know all about the skandas. Yeah, I like the skandas. Or you might think you're the kind of person who can't understand things. Oh, I don't know what he's going on about. What are these things? So there's already a kind of fixedness about the way that we relate to samyā. Rather than samyā sort of operating from moment to moment and sometimes doing a good job, sometimes doing a not very good job, we can attach to the idea of samyā, of I'm the kind of person who is good at bird watching. Hey, I can name that bird. I'm good at that. Or in my case, I feel not quite ashamed, but I don't feel very good at the fact that I've got no idea what trees, can't tell one tree from another. I can just about make out an oak and a willow, and that's about it. And I'd like it to be different. Part of my self-view would like to be a bit of a wild man who recognises green things and can give them the right name. But it's not the case, I'm afraid. I've got a friend who can walk through woods and name pretty much anything you can look at, which to me just looks like green. Yeah. So that's how you might notice samyā, the kind of things that you think you're good at or not good at in terms of understandings. Okay, number 4, samskara. This is a difficult one to translate. Sometimes called formations, or karmic formations, or habit formations. This is quite a big miscellaneous bag, which broadly speaking consists of all the volitional thoughts, emotions, actions of speech, body, speech, mind. So this formation signifies something quite active, isn't it? So there's a kind of energeticness, energy behind samskara, because it's in the process of forming. And it's also what is formed. It's our habits that have been formed by this. So formation is a good translation because it's both a kind of verb and a noun. So it's the act of forming and what's formed by it. So it's our personality, if you like, in terms of how the way we tend to behave, the way we tend to act or react. It includes all emotions, all of our volitions. So it's this kind of active shaping force of our life. And it's got this strongly ethical quality. This is where we need to look for the ethical quality of our behaviour, of our mind. As I say, a lot that could be unpacked about this, but I'll leave it at that for the moment. So the whole area of emotion, papancha comes in here, the sort of trains of thought when we're kind of worrying over things. That's an action of mind, if you like. And so it's got this karmic quality. It's the area of karma, of action. So it's really important to get a handle on this because this is how we learn how to act ethically. We have to learn to notice the ethical quality of our mind, of our volition, and then act accordingly. It's also important to be able to recognise emotion as emotion. I say that because a lot of our emotion is almost maybe I'm speaking as a bloke, almost a kind of background to our experience, almost a sort of filter to our experience. So people might just look irritating, but actually I need to recognise I am irritated. There's a difference there. And all these thoughts that are going through the mind, they might feel like just a whole load of thoughts, but actually there's an emotional energy that's driving them. So if we can sort of bring ourselves back to the level of emotion, then that will give us quite a bit more freedom. And of course we can identify with them, can't we? We can identify with our thoughts and feelings, with our emotions. It's not just that, there's a lot of energy, a lot of angry energy in the body. It's, I am angry, I am seething. So we can, when there's a strong samskara going on, it's very easy to feel, this is me, there's a lot of energy in there. I am anxious. I'm an anxious kind of person. This is us sort of identifying with samskara. That's what it feels like. It becomes a sort of the most important identifying feature of ourself when we identify with it. I'm this kind of person. I'm the kind of person who's really loving. Or I'm the kind of person who's really anxious, or whatever it is. And another way we can identify with it, because this is the area of volition, I am the one who is acting. I am the one who's choosing to act in this way. I am the actor, the agent. So these are all ways that you might tune into identification with samskara. And finally, vijnana, consciousness. Consciousness. This is one I'll say least about because we'll go on to it next week a bit more. So consciousness is the knowing quality of any experience. The knowing quality of experience. There's no experience without this knowing quality. That's kind of deep sleep, if you like. When there's no kind of experience at all, that's because vijnana is switched off. So anything that is known, any sound, any sight, any taste, touch, smell or thought is, as it were, known by vijnana, by consciousness. So certainly in the early Buddhist teachings, consciousness, vijnana, is always, as it were, paired with a sense, with one of the six senses. So there's the knowing of sight, the knowing of sounds, the knowing of thoughts and so on. So when consciousness meets the eye, so to speak, it sees. When it meets the ear, it hears. And this manifests, as it were, the whole world, the whole external world and the whole internal world is manifested by consciousness, with consciousness, so to speak. As such, it's very difficult to talk about. So how do we work with this? Well, one thing is just to marvel at the knowing quality of all experience, that all experience is lit up, and I'm not just talking visual experience. It's, as it were, lit up, to use light as a metaphor. Yes, we're not a robot which presumably doesn't subjectively experience all of its senses. It's like we've got these senses, these sense bases, but they light up. They kind of produce experience, which is what we call vijnana, consciousness. So we could marvel at this, just the actual beingness of being is extraordinary. We can feel how it's constantly flowing, how consciousness is always flowing. There's no two moments of consciousness alike. And we can feel what it's like to be identified with consciousness, which is, as it were, the last bastion of identity, is I am the one who knows, I'm the one who experiences. It's like I am the sort of the seer behind the eyes. I'm the one who's listening through the ears. I'm the one who's feeling in the body, the one who's thinking. I don't know if you remember the numbskulls. Did anyone read the numbskulls cartoon? It's probably before and after different people's times, where you have this the human being is you sort of see them in a sort of cut through, and inside the head there's little numbskulls, these little beings who are doing all the thinking, and there's some who are looking through a little telescope like this, and there's some with a little ear trumpet doing the listening, and so we kind of can feel like we're that, like we're the little numbskulls doing all of the sensing. So notice that happening. Is that necessary? Okay, so that's all I want to say individually about these skandas. Skandas, these 5 heaps, like these 5 different sort of colours. You refract our being into these 5 different colours. So you've got form, rupa, you've got feeling tone, vedana, you've got recognition, perception, samya, you've got volitional tendencies or something like that, formations, samskara, and you've got consciousness, vijnana. And in terms of practice, for each of them, you can sort of just start to tune in to, okay, what's that like? How can I recognise that actually happening in my experience, rather than it being a funny Buddhist term? Can I recognise Vedana? Can I recognise samskara? I remember, I don't know how long it took me, but I remember a point in my practice when I realised I was starting to see my experience through this filter, through this perspective of the skandas. I was starting to experience myself in terms of the skandas. And that felt like an important turning point. I sort of felt, oh right, I'm sort of starting to get a sense of this, which is me identifying with samya, but there we go. So that's the first thing we can do. We can start to tune in to those skandhas. We can notice how, and when we can do that, notice the skandhas are always changing, they're always in flow, always shifting. Somehow or other, it feels like, I'll come back in a second, somehow or other it feels like, even though they're all changing, somehow the sum total of them is me and is fixed. So it's like we have to sort of recognise that when we look at all the components of me, they're all changing, so there's something funny going on there.